Welcome to Talking Freire and Environmentalism, Ecopedagogy, where we discuss the needs, challenges, and possibilities of reinventing Freire and other critical pedagogues for education leading to praxis for environmental justice, well-being, and sustainability, including and beyond humans. It is hosted by the Paulo Freire Institute at UCLA, which is a part of a network of 15 institutes worldwide started over 20 years ago. We're happy to have you here. Our guest, Dr. William Misiaszek, is an associate professor at Beijing Normal University in the Faculty of Education. He serves as associate director of the Paulo Freire Institute at UCLA. In addition to numerous articles and chapters on ecopedagogy, Greg has authored 3 books on ecopedagogy and is the editor of Bloomsbury's Freirean-focused short-length book series, along with Dr. Carlos Alberto Torres. His latest book, Freire and Environmentalism, Ecopedagogy, is within the series that targets a widened readership beyond the traditional academic audience, especially those who might not know about Freire and or ecopedagogy extensively. It might not be in the education field overall. Prior knowledge on Freire is not needed to read the books within the Freirean Focus series, as all complex terms and theories are explained in easier to read wording. As well, the books are shorter in length, at about 150 pages or less than $20 to purchase, and can almost fit in your pocket. However, they can also be bought electronically, so on the Kindle, Apple Books, etc. His other 2 books are Educating the Global Environmental Citizen, Understanding Ecopedagogy in Local and Global Contexts, Routledge 2018, and Ecopedagogy, Critical Environmental Teaching for Planetary Justice and Global Sustainable Development, Bloomsbury 2020. He also has 4 edited books, with the 2 closest ones on the topic we talked to him about being Paulo Freire Centennial, Reinventing and Reinvigorating Freire, Routledge late 2023, with Lauren Isla Misiaszek, and the Palgrave Handbook on Critical Theories of Education, Springer 2022, with Ali A. Abdi. To delve deeper into Greg's work, visit his website at ecopedagogy.com. Welcome to Talking Freire and Environmentalism, Ecopedagogy.
Well, thank you for having me. I look forward to this discussion.
Definitely. So I have a list of questions, and first, within a minute or 2, how would you describe your environmental teaching work?
I think overall how I take ecopedagogy is this aspect of how can we teach students on how to critically read environmental violence? Who benefits, who suffers, and what are the politics behind that? So, and also when we're talking about who, that includes the rest of Earth or the rest of nature. So what are the politics, what are the influences of why we commit environmental devastation, and who does it hurt? So I think within a minute or 2, that would be my kind of elevator speech, if the elevator was going quite a few floors.
That's perfect. Thank you for that. And what levels of education do you focus on?
Well, overall, I probably focus on all different levels of education. So informal, non-formal, and formal education. I think I'm kind of going into the aspect of more higher education and also university education or higher education overall. But my overall aspect is trying to figure out how do people learn about environmental issues from public pedagogy. What do they see on advertisements, in movies, social media? How does that also relate to formal education at all different levels? I do focus more on higher education and adult education, but also what are those interactions? Those interactions of, say, I just finished an article on how does higher education have us learn about the environment and also mislearn about the environment? Not only what happens inside the campuses, but also knowledge production from higher education, and also people's or students and their parents' aspirations of going into higher education, what's considered legitimate knowledge, and all of those epistemological issues, and how does that relate back to how do we view the environment? So for that question, I would say all of the different levels altogether, and also probably even most so probably public pedagogy. How do we understand environment through everything outside of formal education, but also affected by formal education, and also, of course, society, education. We can't have a division. So, those interactions of both ways.
That's perfect. I love that point about legitimacy too, and focusing on all different levels. Perfect. And so, how do you describe your teaching approaches, and what kind of methods or practices would you promote?
I think overall, I mean, it's very much, I would call myself a Freirean, so very much democratic, bottom up, definitely with research, but also in education, in teaching. So not only in the discussions that we have in learning spaces, but also the syllabus, curriculum development. Some of my students say, well, I don't want to read as much that's on the syllabus. The teacher still has authority in the classroom, but they shouldn't have authoritarianism. So it's this aspect of how can we co-construct and still get through the materials that we should, and also bringing in the local materials, local knowledges from the students themselves. And a lot of people talk about, well, then it just becomes discussions within one space. But it's also this aspect of how do you bring in outside voices to talk about environmental issues? What books, what articles, what media are we going to bring in? Also, teaching should be problem posing and trying to figure out, what are possible solutions. And a lot of that is this aspect of how Michaela Ensweiler talks about it in Pedagogy or Praxis, this aspect of what is currently happening now, and what are the perspectives of everyone in the classroom, what is possible, that utopian aspect of environmental issues, and what are the limit situations? What are the gaps between what's currently happening and what could be happening? And there's a lot more to say, but I think one of the other key things too is trying to construct a safe learning environment. So students aren't just saying what I want to hear as a professor, as a teacher, but they really talk about their authentic voices, authentic dialogue. So without going into too much elaboration, that's pretty much what I would say would be my overall teaching style, which is very much coincides with Freire pedagogy. I don't always do it perfectly, to say the least, but you also learn along the way.
Right, definitely. And that's a big point of Freireanism too, with communion with the community. So that's perfect. Thank you so much for that.
Definitely.
And then are there different areas or regions or populations that you focus on more than others?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the key things is that I guess I'm more of a globalist, but not a globalist from above, I would say. So I think a lot of my aspects is looking at it. My official degree from UCLA is in comparative education, critical comparative education. So I would say my overall aspect is comparing and contrasting. When I did my dissertation many years ago now, I focused on Argentina, Brazil, and the Appalachia region of the United States. But what I did then and also continue to do is compare and contrast different regions, and doing it in such a way that there isn't one best region or one best way of teaching, which was very much of a top-down approach in comparative education for many years. So what I really look at, I think mostly, is looking at different local to global south, global north. What is the planetary aspects of things, of learning? And what are those oppressions, of socio-historical oppressions, racism, say, patriarchy, heteronormativity, coloniality, and so on and so on. How does that affect education? How do we learn about the environment, and how do we not learn about the environment? And economics between different regions of the world. So I think I went a little bit astray from the question, but I think overall I would say that a lot of my work is on these aspects of these probably more widened perspectives and things like that. And one of my favorite things to do with co-authors, especially with students or past students of mine, is really writing with them in their own context, especially when they focus upon ecopedagogy directly, but a lot of times indirectly too. So it's not a perfect answer, but that's how I would probably answer that question.
Sounds perfect. And that idea of globality with global citizenship education is definitely in that too, I feel.
Oh, yes. Yeah, global education is, one of the key aspects too that I kind of focus on too, but also citizenship, especially including global citizenships, is a contested terrain, so there can be multiple politics of that and stuff like that. So it all depends on how you define global citizenship and all those different aspects.
Definitely. So then how do you see your environmental work with connecting with Paulo Freire?
Well, I mean, ecopedagogy emerged from Freire. I've written some on this, certain people like Michaela Ensweiler and others from the Sao Paulo Institute in the Paulo Freire Institute in Sao Paulo. So I think this question I can probably talk about for a while answering it. But I think some of the key things is, one is that this aspect of literacy. Freire talked about how do you teach literacy for students to read the word, to read the world. Ecopedagogy expands on that. How do you teach students to read the word, to read the world within Earth? This aspect that the world, as Freire and others talk about, is that all humans and all human societies, and Earth as all of nature, including human beings. So how do we understand things through Earth? And Freire's book that, when Freire passed away, his next publication was supposed to be actually on ecopedagogy, and a lot of his work went into pedagogy of indignation. But he also started talking about environmental issues more and more within pedagogy of the heart, pedagogy of freedom, pedagogy of the city, things like that. But he really wanted to focus on that aspect. And myself and Carlos Alberto Torres were a chapter on what a fifth chapter of Pedagogy of the Press would look like in Carlos's Wiley handbook on Paulo Freire. And can talk more about that later on, but we might not have enough time. But Freire also talked about it was also possibly a missing chapter of Pedagogy of the Press. Gives us different reasons where, Freire talks about, or a lot of scholars now talk about, the silences and reinventing. That work has to be reinvented, including his own. But I'm getting a little bit away from your overall question. So literacy. So deepened and widened ecopedagogical literacy, this aspect of looking at environmental issues from a wide perspective, planetary, global, things like that. How can we understand, when I'm buying styrofoam cups, how does that affect climate change, for example? To deepened, looking into the contextual, local aspects and everything in between. And also, I think this aspect of utopia, this aspect of that, that a lot of people say, well, environmental issues is a necessary evil. And that's one of the things from Pedagogy of the Press, or even his earlier work before then, this aspect that education is a lot of times fatalistic. And that the oppressions that come from social injustices, environmental injustices, and those inseparable connections between them has us looking upon other populations and us looking upon ourselves that, maybe oppressions, maybe injustices are inherent, and I inherently should be oppressed, for example. So I think one of the key things is also utopia, and also this aspect of trying to figure out what are possible solutions going towards that. Like I said before, this aspect of dialogue. You need to talk about this aspect of what's currently happening in teaching and what's possible. And Freire talked about that, those aspects of that gap in between is that limit situations. So ecopedagogy is very much this aspect of praxis or action-oriented. how can we teach in such a way that it transforms society into a better society? But ecopedagogy actually is also adds this aspect of how can we make it as a more sustainable Earth, more sustainable planet. And also there's all those contradictions. Not only do you have contradictions of the benefits and the suffering from different populations of the world, but also how does that go towards this aspect of planetary sustainability, nature's well-being beyond human, that's non-anthropocentric, beyond human benefits, for example. So ecopedagogy actually makes it a little bit more complicated than even the most complex aspects of the world and stuff like that. So, I guess ending this aspect of Freire brings in this way of trying to understand the world, to problematize the world, but even beyond the world, this aspect of the planetary sphere on what are the connections between environmental violence and social violence. How is that taught? How is that not taught? And very much that's important to ecopedagogy and Freire's work. What are the politics, the influences of them not being taught, mistaught, things like that?
Definitely. Yeah, I love this idea of totality versus focalized visions and the idea of the unfinishedness that we still have.
Yeah, and unfinishedness is very much, I mean, there's so much to say about Freire. Unfinishedness is definitely one of the key aspects, that this aspect of that we're unfinished beings, unfinished societies. And some people talk about, well, that's also that Freire was very much destroying traditions and cultures. That's not what Freire was saying. Freire was very much talking about that preserving local cultures, local traditions, and things like that, but also challenging how does our different actions affect other people, form oppressions, form suffering, form environmental injustices, forming aspects where the planet is going to devastation and things like that. So this aspect of unfinished beings is kind of interesting within the planetary sphere, because the rest of nature outside of humans is going kind of towards this equilibrium. So it's this aspect of, that, if an earthquake happens right here in Mexico City, I'm at right now, it isn't an injustice from nature to me. It's just going back into equilibrium, lessening the tension between tectonic plates. I have taken some classes in these things, but I'm not sure if I am using all the terminology exactly. Or the hurricanes, air pressures, all these different things. If a bear attacks me, probably not here in Mexico City, but I guess the zoo is nearby. So if a bear escapes and kills me, it isn't an injustice to me, because it's only humans that have reflexivity that's connected towards histories that we remember and build upon, for the better and worse, our histories, and we're able to dream and go towards praxis. This aspect that we can use our dreams, use utopia, going towards a better world, a better livelihoods, more sustainable planet, and things like that. And it's an aspect of reciprocal justice. And this comes from Karen Warren, say, in ecofeminism, that justice comes from reciprocal rather than, a one-way thing, that if I go outside, a tree falls on me, I get hurt or get killed. That doesn't mean that that is an injustice to me, but more of an act of nature.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely true. And I like this idea of problematizing throughout histories too, coming up with that unfinishedness, speaking to those human acts. Also, do you connect Paulo Freire's work with specific scholars' work on ecopedagogy?
Yeah, there's quite a bit, quite a few scholars, but not the same. It's still a relatively unknown field compared to other fields, even of other environmental pedagogy, say environmental education, education for sustainable development, and others. And so that's one of the reasons why I use this term environmental pedagogy, is because it's kind of this aspect of critical environmental education, critical ESD. But I think the essence of ecopedagogy is this essence of emergent from popular education movements of Paulo Freire and others. So just to name a few, I mean, I think one of the key ones is probably, and some people call him the grandfather of ecopedagogy, Ivan Illich. He has a very short book, a very powerful book, very controversial book, Deskilling Society. And he has his last chapter on that, in that book, chapter 7, is very much going into this aspect of ecopedagogy, even though he doesn't call it that. You know, this aspect that, I won't go into it, but one of his main arguments is that between classic man and modern man, and apologize for the gender. Unfortunately, it has been that gender that has devastated a lot of the world and stuff. But when he wrote it, he's classic man and modern man, contemporary man. The classic man would do something against the environment, but he would know there would be consequences, that he's challenging. Modern man, contemporary man, and he wrote this back in 71, I believe it came out, that we challenge nature and we think that we can get away with everything because, well, there's going to be technologies that come up. There's going to be, you know, that we're more powerful, our knowledge and things like that. And over time, over and over again, we can see that this is not, no matter how much we're going to, you know, unwill, you know, climate change not to happen. Or I've written on this, you know, try to make COVID-19 a political aspect. Still, if not 7 million people died of it globally, almost 7 million people died as the official count, and that's probably a low count. No matter how we construct it in the world, in our subjectivity and things like that, it still led to suffering. It still led to death and things like that. So Ivan Illich, one of the first books on ecopedagogy, or I would say the first book, although I've read a couple of citations that say that there was other publications 1 or 2 years before this, but in 1989, Francisco Gutierrez and Cruz Prado wrote in Spanish, but the translation was Ecopedagogy and Planetary Citizenship. They were the directors of the Paulo Freire Institute in San Juan, in Costa Rica, and very much Freireans, of course. And I would say probably, I mean, there's other people like Richard Kahn, Ivo Dickman, many others. But I think probably the most prominent one there that I use and is a wonderful colleague and consider him a friend, is Monsieur Gadodi, who is the founder and director of the Paulo Institute in Sao Paulo, and he's written a lot for the Earth Charter. He's written a lot for UNESCO. He's written a lot on ecopedagogy. So I would say his work with students has probably, I would say, would have probably the biggest influence on ecopedagogy, I would say, globally by far.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And all of these speak to different kinds of educational systems too. And I really like the differences between those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then you touched on utopias a little bit, but what are some other overarching goals of your environmental work? So like thinking short-term, long-term, low-hanging fruit within a utopia or utopias?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think to save the planet, I think overall. And actually, Godot's one of his famous books, a short book, but very well written and extraordinary, had the subtitle "Saving the Planet." And it's not a hyperbole. I mean, it's this aspect of how can we turn back? Hopefully we can turn back from these turning points of environmental devastation, these drop points, I forget the term, but that we're not going over the cliff, that we're not the frog in the water slowly boiling, but eventually am going to boil and things like that. But how can we turn down the temperature? How can we do all those things? And I think one of the key things is this aspect of how can we really, especially with increased globalization, especially when we're talking about the internet, how can we teach students to critically read the internet, critically read media? Because no matter how many hours you have students in a classroom, no matter how many assignments you give them or readings to do and things like that, there's no way that you're going to touch upon everything. So I think this aspect of ecopedagogical literacy, this aspect of giving the skills of being able to read, especially the politics, the influences. It's a lot of environmental pedagogies, I would say, are shallow. This aspect that, well, these environmental things are bad, so we're going to have to do these 3 steps, but they never go into the deeper issues. Even not even, but the UNESCO, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, all 16 of them, the 17th one is kind of partnership, so I always take out the first 16. They're all very well intentioned, but one of my criticisms is that they're also very shallowly written too. And others have said this too. I can think of, off the top of my head, Stephen Cleese from University of Maryland, and Roger Dale from the UK, and many others, is that that language, that it isn't to offend those powerful nations of UNESCO, and not to disrupt the global market. Comes close, and people working on the SDGs or global citizenship education, and especially outside scholars such as Carlos Torres with the first UNESCO chair in global learning and global citizenship education, him and others, very much, criticize these different aspects, but also can see the good. So everything's kind of a contested train. But I think one of the key things is not so much, teaching more and more to students, but to teach students the skills, the understandings, the dialogical processes that a lot of times we've been losing a lot of times because it's been such a hard, right or left. And as one example, but a big example, say in politics and things like that, that we no longer listen to each other. But how can we look at things from different perspectives? And also, I think the last thing I want to say on this is this aspect of how can we listen, including reading, from the people who suffer themselves. So this aspect of bottom up is very much needed in research, but also in education. How can we select curricula? How can we teach students to look at what they see on the internet, how they interact with one another in social media? How can they do that in such a way that they're looking from the eyes of those who are suffering from environmental devastation, either across the street or on the other side of the world? So I think that those are my overall goals, I think. And also trying to align formal education where it's not, the aspect that all assessment is, how much knowledge the student can show that they have memorized, but how can they problematize that knowledge? How can they problematize these larger issues when we're talking about environmental devastation, peace, all these different aspects? So that's, I think that would be my overall goal if I were to say one.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think it's really apt in the direction we're heading with this new technology, social media, and even AI. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, AI is an interesting one because it all, I just had a wonderful student in my ecopedagogy class talk about this, and I was going through her paper, and one of the key things is that where is AI getting the information from? And I think that's one of the key things that is very much problematic. So, for example, they had that one experiment where they had the AI just go off and have talk by itself, and it became racist, white supremacist. And why is that? Because it was taking information from popular media on stereotyping people. And stereotyping is a nice word and stuff, to say the least, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really important, this scope of critical literacy and criticalness of these different systems.
Mm-hmm.
So then what are the largest obstacles or barriers in achieving those environmental goals?
Yeah, that's a good question. That can be quite a long answer. I would say give me like 5, 6 different things that I just will go through very briefly. One I would say fatalism. This aspect that how the world is currently is how the world is going to be forever. But we've made the world how it is. As humans, we can also change the world. It's very much difficult. The world has been constructed through oppressions, but also points of enlightenment, empowerment, freedom, all these different things too. Second one I would say probably is coloniality. And I think this aspect that a lot of times people say, well, why are we worried about coloniality and stuff? That was in the past and stuff. How has those histories developed into the future? And now how has globalizations as a contested train from above and from below, how does that continue? Why is a lot of the nations that are the richest in natural resources seen as the least powerful, for example? Another one would be this aspect of neoliberalism, that everything comes down to economics, from health, from environmental concerns, things like that. It's not just neoliberalism with economics, because economics can be very much, you can have economic justice, you can have labor justice and other aspects. But it's this aspect that it is grounded in hegemony. It's grounded in the people who have to keep continuing to have. It's kind of a weird statement that I said then, but I think maybe you understand what I mean. It isn't supposed to be this aspect of, everyone is getting wealthy, but the wealthier are getting more and more wealthy. And then there's a hidden curriculum that it benefits everyone, where it very much doesn't. And that neoliberalism is very much connected to, and this is from Dirk Postma's work, Why Do We Care for Nature? And I hope I get that right, that title. But he talks about how neoliberalism is making us only care about our private sphere. What do I have? How can I profit? And the public sphere, the rest of the world, and even larger, the rest of the planet, I don't really care about unless it affects my private sphere. So there's all of those different aspects. I think socio-historical oppressions, coloniality is one of them, but also connected to patriarchy, heteronormativity, all these different aspects. And how does that connect back when we talk about things like eco-racism and things like that? I think the 5th or 6th, I'm not sure which one I'm on, but this aspect of citizenship. Citizenship can be very, very good, can be very powerful, but a lot of times we teach how we should treat the non-citizen, how do we other the non-citizen and things like that. And one of the key things with good global citizenship education, and I put that in quotations, good, is this aspect that how can we teach in such a way that everyone is a citizen because they're humans or planetary citizen, that if you exist, you're a citizen, and the Earth itself is a citizen. It doesn't take away from traditional citizenship. It doesn't take away from more localized citizenships, but it's this aspect of how can we break that aspect that citizenship is also who is a non-citizen, and how we should make sure that that we other them in different ways. Anthropocentrism, this aspect of that only care about what happens within the human realm. And the last one, I would say, this aspect of post-truthism. I think that that's currently, especially when we're going through elections of Donald Trump and Brexit. and Bolsonaro in Brazil. How has truth become a political opinions? And Freire and critical theories is going towards this aspect of subjectivity, but it's always going towards this aspect of truth-seeking, where post-truthism is this aspect of just politics. And looking at it as a larger issue, that doesn't mean that everyone who's a supporter of Donald Trump, for example, is going towards is this aspect that they a lot of times don't know what they're promoting, and the system is set up for them not to know, but that they are falsely told that they're benefiting from the system, where most of the stuff that he did benefits billionaires, millionaires with many millions and stuff. So I think that those would probably be the biggest obstacles.
Yeah, definitely. And I love how most of those kind of speak to those myths and pedagogy of the oppressed and anti-dialogical actions too. Definitely sounds like that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Even from pedagogy of the oppressed, when you start searching it, Freire started talking about neoliberalism and globalization. He uses those words more in this later book, but very much so. And coloniality was very much of a tool of globalization from above. And that being said, globalization is a contested terrain. So there's many ways that globalization, people use the internet, people using the internet to get out information, to show oppressions, all these different things. It depends on the processes, who benefits and who suffers from that, and things like that. So there's different ways that we can use technologies, that we can use globalizations, but there's many ways that that's not so good. You can do wonderful things about sharing stories and keeping in touch with people and giving out information, say on Facebook, but there's many horrible things too that can emerge from that, to say the least.
Exactly. Yeah, and I feel like you touched on the rights of nature too a little bit in some of those issues. And I think that's, a new area that is being promoted too.
Very much so.
So then, what are the specific critical theories that you utilize in your environmental teaching work?
Yeah, I would say, I think I explained much of the different aspects, but I think thinking back, it would be things like globalizations from above and from below, post-decoloniality. I think some people have said that I'm a post-colonialist and have labeled me as that, which it's not a bad thing to be labeled. I'm just not sure if it's only that, but it's definitely one of the key things. I think a critical aspect of socio-historical oppressions, so critical race theory, eco-racism, feminism, ecofeminism. Don't use too much of it, but trying to learn more about aspects that we can use queer theory too. Definitely Southern theories. And a lot of my work on that is this aspect of epistemologies of the global north, epistemologies of the global south, using work, say, from Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Raywin Kano, Alatis, and others, and Go. Ecolinguistics, I have some work on. So how do we use our wording, our languages, that justifies socio-environmental oppressions? So, for example, even I try to not say the earth. I'm sure if you transcribe this interview, I'll probably have said it a couple times, but I try to just say earth, because the takes out the objectified earth and things like that. One of the key things too, I think is important, is also post-foundational theories. So post-criticalism, post-humanism, and things like that. And I think the key things, there's a couple key reasons for that. But I would say the main thing is that how can we use theories that are not anthropocentric, that's not just focused on humans? And that doesn't take it away from Freire entirely. That doesn't take it away from critical theories entirely, or postmodernism. And postmodernism, it depends on there's a lot of friction a lot of times between critical and postmodern theories. But it's this aspect that, how can we have this, how can we reinvent Freire's work, but also going beyond Freire's work in many ways. In the past, I've used some of liberation theologies. And I think one of the key things too, the last theory that I want to mention is this aspect of critical media theories. So how can we deconstruct media of all different types? And my own work uses, say, Douglas Kellner, Jeff Scher, Richard Kahn, and others. But I think one of the key things that are coming up too is this other aspect of post-digitalism. And the big name in that, who's a wonderful colleague and a good friend, is Peter Jandrik. And he just came out with a book with Derek Ford called Ecopedagogy, Post-Digital Ecopedagogies. And a lot of his work is how can we no longer separate our digital lives from our real lives, and goes into some wonderful details on philosophies and using STEM subjects and reinventing critical media studies and stuff like that. And I believe you too, Michaela, are writing something on post-digitalism too. I'm a second author on that, but a very distant one. So I'm looking forward to constructing that with you.
Yeah, definitely. That's such an exciting book that's coming out too. I'm really excited to see the other perspectives on that too.
Yeah. I mean, the whole encyclopedia is going to have like hundreds of entries, and also Peter has a whole journal dedicated to it. There's a lot out there, to say the least. Encourage anyone viewing this to check those out.
Definitely. That's one of the biggest things I think I like about Freire, that aspect of reinvention and problematization. You can take that with Freire's work and kind of supplement it with all these different theories that keep kind of reinventing different
Definitely.
But also then, what are the Freirean concepts or theories or philosophies do you most utilize in your work then?
Yeah, I think almost all, but probably, with teaching, it's this aspect of really trying to get authentic dialogue through problem posing education through different perspectives. And it's not always easy. I teach in China at Beijing Normal University, and some of the classrooms are rather large. So how do you do that within a larger classroom? But it can be done in different ways. There's been a lot of successes and failures looking back on it. I think that aspect of, creating an environment where students and teachers are both teachers and students, this aspect of problem posing. I think if we really want students to become future leaders, but definitely leaders on their own, already a lot of times we can sometimes miss that. How can we do that with just giving them more and more information without them being able to critically use it and things like that? And also realizing that myself as a teacher or professor is also a learner within that environment. So a lot of times it's, for many people, including myself, who started getting into various this aspect of it is quite a transition and things like that. And so it's this aspect of praxis based. And I think for research, I think one of the key things is that how can we have our research, our ecopedagogical research, but all of our research really go back towards helping the people that we research, helping improve the environment that become more sustainable within that, wherever the location is, and things like that. Because there's always, the researcher will always benefit. We get our funding, for example, we get, degrees, masters, PhD, postdocs, things like that. But how can we make sure that we really go in and help the people. And realizing that it's not that we go in as saviors, to say the least, but how can we amplify their voices, for example. So I think one of the key things is that, this aspect of bottom-up research, and not just that we go into our field work with that, but whenever we write something, whenever I write something on, say, indigenous knowledges, epistemologies of the South, recognizing that I'm from the global North, from the United States originally, and things like that. So how do you do that in such a way that it doesn't become that you're just using that type because it's popular and that you can get published and things like that, but really use their voices and things like that. And it gets complicated, especially when you're going into things like Sandra Harding talking about standpoint theory and feminism and things like that. How can you truly understand a population without being that population, in that population? I always tell my students, if I'm studying a natural disaster in say Rwanda, no matter how much, or natural unsustainability in Rwanda, no matter how much I study, no matter how much research I do, I'm still not going to have exactly the same perspective as the person that's living through that situation. And then you can go into aspect of gender and race and ethnicity and sexuality and all these different things. So, but how can I use my research to also amplify their voices and not go into a situation where I know what the best is, so I'm just gonna, give you, how to solve your problems. Exactly. Freire talked about this a lot of times, as I understood it and have read some, but even people who have known him, communities would ask him, what should we do? And Freire would say, I don't know. I don't know exactly. I can listen to what you say, to listen to different aspects. We can compare and contrast, use methodologies, things like that. But I think the big problem is that just because, we have a MA, MS, PhD, MD after our names as academics, that we can go in and know it all and know what the population needs. And I think it's that bottom-up participatory research in different ways. It doesn't have to be pure participatory research, but very much it has to be coming from local voices. And I think that in itself is part of that. And grounded theory coming from the local populations too.
Right. I love that, using your positionality and your podium to elevate different voices. That's wonderful. And I feel like there's a story somewhere where a Freirean walks into a classroom with bolted seats.
Yeah.
Or we could make one, because that's a common thing that I've seen in classrooms around the world too.
Oh, like the bolters. Yeah, I see that in China somewhere, but I've seen that everywhere. I've seen that. I've also seen it in the United States. So yeah, it all. But I do like some of the, like in my institution, Beijing Normal University. I try to get the, we have these classrooms. A lot of them, I'm in a little pedestal, and all the students. But they have some wonderful classrooms. So universities around the world, a lot of times, but a lot of times it depends on economics. But they have ones where everything is on wheels. And they're getting more and more classrooms like this. So the desks, the chairs, and I love those classrooms because other than having people turn around in bolted desks, at least, at least can move around the classroom, can form different groups and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just go outside after a while. It's
very ecopedagogical of you too.
Right.
Go into nature. Although if it's snowing or raining, it becomes a little bit. Los Angeles is a better climate for that, to say the least.
Definitely, yeah. We get our big coats on.
Yeah.
But so then, in trying to solve environmental issues currently, do you view any aspects of Freire's work or teaching that is too limited in today's societies? Is there some need for reinvention? Freire's maybe some silences, maybe he's too socioeconomic or class oriented. Yeah, I'd love for you to expand on that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest essence of Freire, is this aspect of reinvention. And I've written on this through some of the articles, and currently a special issue that's on educational philosophy and theory with Lauren Misiaszek, talking about the need for reinventions. And that's the essence, that to truly for pedagogy to be useful, and not useful in, not just neoliberal terms, for example, but useful for a population, useful to understand a population, it has to be constantly reinvented. Freire talks about this, and even his own work. That's why, pedagogy of the press, a lot of people who just read pedagogy of the press read it very shallowly. They think, well, Freire's an anti-environmental, anti-environmentalist. Well, why is that? Is that because, well, for various different reasons. One is this aspect that is reinvention of a community, unfinished beings, is destroying traditions and cultures, but also elevating the human being as reflexivity, having histories, and being able to act towards this aspect of utopia or dreaming. But Freire very much, like I already said, very much respected traditions and cultures, to say that at least that was a grounding aspect of it. Environmental, that doesn't mean, he was saying, what is our responsibility? He was not devaluing the rest of nature. And much like how Freire talks about unfinished beings, it's his own work and also his own reflection of his work. Pedagogy of the Press was just one of, I think, his second book, if I'm not mistaken, his most famous book, but it evolved. His other books, kind of came out of that, reinventing his work on pedagogy of the press. Michael Apple talks about this. He talks about that ideology and curriculum. His next books was reinventing that book a lot of times. So I think within that special issue too, Carlos Alberto Torres has a wonderful article on silences of Freire and things like that. In the Wiley Handbook, Ray Morrell talks about the essence of Freirean reinvention and how that taken. So I think a lot of the things that people criticize Freire, for example, not going into race enough, not going into gender and feminism and things like that. Bell Hooks has a wonderful piece talking about very much, why she's a Freirean, for example. So I think it's, how do we reinvent? There is a lot that's missing from Freire's work, silences, but that's for everyone's work. And I think certain people who say, Freire is anti-environmental, Freire is destroying traditions and cultures and things like that, doesn't read the essence of reinvention. And also this aspect of looking at things like post-criticalism and post-humanism. And the post doesn't mean that it's after something happens, or that you take away the critical aspects, critical theories. It's reinventing those. But also there can be new theories, but also, it gets complicated. It's all writing, theory, all of scholarship, messy. It should be messy. It should be complicated. That's not a bad thing. But I think there is a lot of silences. And for example, Freire recognized that one of his silences was on environmentalism with ecopedagogy. And his notes, this is what Mr. Gododi told me about in Sao Paulo, was that a lot of his notes for his next writing on ecopedagogy was actually on his desk when he passed away. And a lot of that, some of it went into pedagogy of indignation. So it's this aspect that we always have to reinvent. We reinvent all theories, understandings on the contextuality. and the needs of the community, the needs of the local communities, the needs for nature, and not just for certain people and things like that. So I think there is a lot of silences. I would say that every scholar has that, to say the least. So a lot of it is this aspect of how can we critically reinvent it. And also, I've written some on this, but other people have written more, making sure that when we say reinvent, that that it's within the groundings of Freire scholarship, or in a simple way, questioning and re-questioning, problematizing, what do we do in Freire's name? So how can we critically and really understand that, especially when we're going into these issues of reinventing his work, and especially reinventing it towards ecopedagogy, critical environmental teaching, and things like that. When I wrote with Carlos Torres the missing ecopedagogy, the missing chapter of pedagogy is press for his Wiley handbook, a half or 2/3 was trying to figure out and tell the readers that we're not exactly sure what Freire would have written, but probably would have definitely written it better and more eloquently than we will in the second half or the second third of the chapter, but doing that in a way that's not with hubris and things like that. So I can keep on going, but I'll stop there.
That's excellent. And that definitely, the reinvention also speaks to that piece about unfinishedness too, so that it can go with a lot of different aspects.
Definitely. And scholarship, and I mean, Freire said this, and scholarship and theories are meaningless unless they lead towards some sort of action, and that theories are coming out of experiences and things like that, living experiences and things like that.
Definitely. Yeah. So if Freire was living today, what do you think he would focus most on with environmental teaching?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think he would continue his work on this aspect of unfinishedness and utopia in education. I think that's one of the key things. I mean, with intensifying globalization from above, which can be very much connected to neocoloniality, that there's more of a push that this aspect of, say, neoliberalism reality, that everything that isn't neoliberal is fanciful, is that we can talk about a different world, but we never are going to change the world. And I think that would continue to frustrate him after his death, and increasingly so. So I think that the cultural invasions, the pedagogical invasions of certain parts of the world, the global north, global south, global north, more on aspects of power rather than geographics. I think that would be one of the key issues, looking at how has this aspect of fatalism that the world is, and that he talks about in Pedagogy of Freedom or Pedagogy of the Heart, I forgot. He talks about how can we compare within the market, within the global market, rag pickers in Brazil, in the favelas, compared to someone working on Wall Street. It's inherently an oppressed system, and it's inherently going to be unsustainable system environmentally and in other ways. So I think he would continue to try to question, and I would say within ecopedagogical aspects, but in other aspects too, this aspect of, how can we teach in such a way that we can critically, radically transform the world so we don't kill ourselves and destroy all of nature.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important.
Yeah.
And what do you think he would be most glad to see?
Well, I think I think there's talk a lot about negative things. I always tell students this, there is a lot of positive things that have happened. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, just even in the United States, things that have changed. A lot of things have stayed the same, but there has been amazing progress in different ways. I think he would be glad to see how socioeconomic class structures have been expanded and the reinventions of his work and other people's work. And I think he would very much, I mean, he rewrote Pedagogy of the Press for two different reasons. One, and this is from Daniel Shugorensky's Bloomsbury Paulo Freire book. I think that's the title. He rewrote it, one with that chapter 4. They wanted to add a more pragmatic chapter. That's why chapter 4 is seems a little bit different than the other chapters. But it was first going to be 3 chapters. But the other thing is that he read Frantz Fanon, and he reworked a lot of his ideas from Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. I think he would see the benefits of, say, the internet, especially post 1997, when internet was in its infancy, but would also obviously see the negative aspects too. I think with aspects that it has empowered people, it has led towards social justice and environmental justice issues and things like that. But I think those would be the things that he would. There's a lot, but just thinking about it right now, I think that those would probably be the top 3 things and stuff like that. I'm sure I'm gonna, once we end this interview, I'm gonna kick myself that I didn't say other things, but I think there's a lot of good things that Freire would have seen as good, but also, a lot of things not so good or very negative, or even worse, much worse.
Yeah, it's a dose of positivity, but what do you think he would be least happy about?
Not enough of progress, to say the least. How did some things return? I mean, I think, how is there more of an acceptance, say, in the United States for neo-Nazis, for example, and things like that, white supremacy? I mean, a lot of people say that has never gone away, and stuff, it just has come up in the media more with, say, Trump and stuff. I hate mentioning his name. Has brought that up, in Brexit and Bolsonaro in Brazil, where how did that all come up? I think he would be, the internet is the most democratic tool that we have. I mean, I can write something here in Mexico City and someone in Rwanda can read it. There's digital divides and things like that, but people can voice their opinions and stuff like that. But I think one of his main frustrations would be this aspect that we have more knowledge right now, increasingly at our fingertips, but are we a better society? And a lot of times we're more and more separated. In the dialogical process where, the internet, social media, I can pick my channel, I can pick my, chat room, I can pick my all different things, my Facebook feeds and whatever, that I know, that I can pick and choose my opinion, and it just gets entrenched without listening, without having the groundings of having different perspectives. And I think the last thing that he would be, and going off of this topic of dialogue, I think the least one would be this aspect of post-truthism. It's an aspect that we no longer, a lot of times, are going towards truth-seeking, going towards what's correct. That has always been the case. There's been wars fabricated, say, by Hearst and others. But I think it's to such a degree right now, and with the manipulation of the internet and search engines and analytics of Facebook and things like that, I think the overall essence and I think I'll stop here after this aspect of dialogue, is this aspect that for dialogue, taking, Habermas and Foucault and others, that dialogue has to have a base of some sort of truth, if not truth, some sort of basis that two or more people can agree upon. But with post-truthism, it's no longer going towards some sort of truth. So how can we have this aspect of dialogue, diverse dialogue, dialectic, different perspectives on environmental issues, social issues, all these different things, when we can no longer agree upon just even the basis of truth? Is the world, is Earth a circular in shape? For example, that the Earth isn't flat. These different things. So yeah, I could keep on going. That unfortunately, what he probably would be very much disappointed at, but those are the first couple of things.
Definitely. I could see that for sure. And going along with that, though, what is the largest contextual aspect that differs today compared to when he was alive, do you think?
Well, probably, I think the internet would probably be the biggest thing and stuff like that, the vastness of it, the power of the internet. And the second thing would be, the aspects that how close, and in a utopic way, I don't want to say that we are already over, but how close are we coming to the tipping points of environmental devastation and things like that? A lot of people, I can think of Scheer and others, talk about that critical theories had an emergence after World War II. And why was that? It was first, the Holocaust happened, and how can we teach in such a way that people just don't follow a leader in their party towards oppressions and genocide and all these different things. And the second one was the atomic bomb. The first time that we can blow ourselves up rather easily, unfortunately. So how can we go towards this aspect of critically looking at the overall situation and things like neoliberalism, globalization from above, things like that we no longer care about? Coloniality, racism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, all these things that we no longer, that has us not caring about someone else. Orientalism, so on and so on. How can we understand that we're part of this living being within all of nature, for example? So I think this aspect of going more and more closer towards the points of no return, that fatalistic notion. And what I've written before is that if you really want fatalism, that's fatalism. That's I've written about, hopefully during at the very first stages of COVID, I've written that hopefully COVID is horrible, but hopefully it'll recognize that we don't have total control of nature and some other arguments, but overall, that we become that classic man, and other genders associated with that, with you just using Eliot's terminology, that we realize that when we challenge nature, there is going to be consequences. But unfortunately, I just returned from AERA and probably going to write this up somewhere. Unfortunately, a lot of those hopeful things didn't occur, a lot because of post-truthism and things like that. But there is no vaccine for environmental issues, so that's a difficult thing.
Yeah, definitely. I can definitely see that too, with these gaps starting to widen too.
Yeah.
So going forward then, what are you hoping to work on in the near future on ecopedagogy?
Well, there's a couple of things. There's a couple of things we want to, for example, there's a Bloomsbury Encyclopedia of Environmental Education, where myself and Karen Malone from Australia, although it's a general encyclopedia, very much critical oriented. trying to unpack Freire in more diverse ways and things like that. For example, writing for a journal article right now on, you know, the attack on sociology and the social sciences. How does that take away the ability for transdisciplinary aspects of higher education that should be going towards solving these larger issues, no matter what discipline you're in? And I think overall ecopedagogical aspects of trying to disrupt post-truthism, I think that that's one of the key things. And one of the things, like I said before, is that one of the things I really enjoy doing is writing with people who are working much more in the field in different areas of the world, and writing with them and seeing how ecopedagogy, and not just glorifying ecopedagogy, not just glorifying Freire and stuff like that, but that, you know, how can we compare and contrast all these different aspects and reinvent his work and see where reinventions might not work and have to go in a totally different direction. We're trying to figure out how can we utilize ecopedagogy. But there could be that there's many other environmental pedagogies out there too, especially from the global south, that aren't, you know, discussed. And making sure that when I write something, Kaya Rodriguez and Payne has a wonderful article on this, is that when do we use as academics post too much, you know, post whatever theory, where sometimes those ideas, those constructions have been other people's work, especially in the global south, indigenous knowledges. And Freire himself would say, you know, that his work comes out of a multitude of different scholars' work. It's not just coming from thin air. So I'm not sure if I entirely answered your question, but that's how I would begin to answer it, at least.
Yeah, that's perfect. And that sounds really exciting too. What are the biggest challenges for you in doing this work, do you think?
Oh God, it's a lot. I mean, I think the biggest resistance is this aspect of the world becoming more and more neoliberal. It's more positivistic. And there was, oh, I forgot her name. Maybe we can include it in the in the introduction, or I can put it as a comment. But the IOE in Geneva, as part of UNESCO, the head of that, it kills me that I can't remember the director's name right now. But she was saying, you know, what do we teach for? What is the easiest things that we can test for, and stuff like that. Those connections, you know. And it's difficult. How do you teach for global citizenship, sustainable praxis, peace education, things like that? No matter how you teach it in the class, how can that transfer into the real environment to enact change and things like that? I've been to a few UNESCO conferences, and I think one in Paris. You know, the question came up, this is a wonderful thing in curricula that we need to change, but how can we test for it? And that's one of the biggest problems. But I wouldn't say that it's so much a problem. It's those things that we don't or can't or find difficulty in testing for, those are the most important things. You know, there's different reasons why people attend higher education, for example. You know, there is this aspect of employment and working, and you know, what does it mean to someone's life to be in a certain position, working in a certain position? So it's beyond economics. But also, you know, higher education and everything before that and everything after that with lifelong learning, you know, it should be going towards how can we teach, how can I learn also on my own towards understanding for better praxis, for more sustainable praxis, for more socio-environmental justice practice, for all these different things. But I think the main problem is this aspect of post-truthism and the politics behind that, and a lot of people who push that don't know that they're pushing that because they truly believe it. How can we counter that? And also neoliberalism, where everything comes down to numbers, to economics. Michael Apple has a wonderful saying that I've heard him say a bunch of times, we test everything that moves, and then we test everything that doesn't move just in case it might move later on. Testing is important, assessment is important, but over-testing, over-standardization, de-skilling teachers, and so on and so on, and not having an education where critical thinking, critical problem solving is not seen as the end goal. I think that that's the big problem. And I see that more increasing than decreasing. And even faculty work and getting faculty jobs and teaching and things like that. There's so much turnaround on teaching. On faculty, it's so much connected to, funding and things like that. So I think that these and many other ways that ecopedagogical work, but also just having ecopedagogy at some different ways in the formal education system, I think these are the large barriers. Teachers are very much good-willed, but there's so much standards. There's so much, their job, it's so much pressured for certain test scores and things like that. It's a system that's a lot of times working against them.
Definitely. So with all of these big challenges, what personally drives you in your eco-pedagogical work?
I think hope, with a lot of moments, minutes, hours, days of being depressed, maybe not is the best word, but being frustration. But I think it's the aspect that Massimiliano Terrosi from the University of Bologna with at Beijing Normal University, and he said, as teachers, we have to be optimistic, because why else would we do the profession? Not many teachers are going to be millionaires. Very few of them are going to be billionaires. It isn't that the most respected, depending on where in the world there's different respect levels. China teachers are much more respected than, say, the United States, to say the least. But it's this hope. There's hope for the future, teaching for future generations and things like that. But I think overall that that this optimistic notion that even through the difficulties, that we truly have made the world how it is as human beings. Now, does that coincide with sustainability, not sustainability, and all the oppressions and things that has went into that, injustices, inequalities, wars, all these horrible things? But we can also change the world. And one of the key things too, maybe my last comment on this is this aspect that a lot of people say, well, utopia in education, hope in education. Well, that's just fanciful. That means that you can dream about anything. No, it's understanding the realities also. It's understanding, Freire talked about this, that a lot of people glance over when they diss Freire and utopia in education. He and others who have reinvented his work, it isn't this aspect that it's, if we're going to talk about gravity in a physics class, that doesn't mean that, if I drop a pin, we're going to just talk about, if the pin would like fly out the window or things like that. We still talk about the realities. And the problem posing education, this aspect of praxis learning, pedagogy of praxis that Ecopedagogy talks about, what is currently happening in dialogue in the classroom, what could happen or should happen, and that should and could is very much utopias, not just one utopia. What is that gap? It's that gap that how can we overcome those limit situations of environmental violence, unsustainable environmental violence, need some sort of utopia and things like that. And even though there's a lot of moments of frustration, sometimes even anger on what happens with education throughout the world and its uses and misuses, I would say, it's probably a better word. there is a lot to be hopeful for and things like that. So I guess that overall is hope. That has a lot of moments of frustrations and disappointment, but still going, like Carl Storrs talks about, going towards a horizon, going towards, some other people think go towards the northern light and things like that. It's going towards that. That doesn't mean that it's overall going to achieve it. We hope to, but it's going towards the same thing as when a lot of my students, there's a lot of things to problematize about the sustainable development goals. One of the frustrations, and most of my students are from the global south, my graduate classes, they talk about, well, aren't these goals made to never be achieved? But that's kind of the essence of goals. You know, it's the essence of going towards something rather than entirely achieving it and things like that. And how can we achieve these goals within the larger aspect of Earth? And that we can change our worlds, being subjective and stuff like that. Rest of Earth is going towards these aspects of laws of nature. And we know many of them, but many of them we don't know about nature, the unknowledge and things like that. And how can Bonaventure de Sousa Santos, how can we not only learn but unlearn? What are the absences in our teaching? So it's straight from the question, but yeah, just hope, I guess I would say.
It's a very positive thing, and I think hope definitely ties into that idea of unfinishedness and reinvention also. Just kind of pushing forward with it.
Definitely.
So then to end out, are there any other aspects you'd like to discuss?
Nope. I think we covered it all and stuff. I think we probably went over a little bit of the time, but no, I mean, I think there's a lot more to say. There's a lot more things that I haven't said that I don't know. But I think overall, I think one of the key things is, you know, is trying to reinvent ecopedagogy in ways that's going towards globally all-inclusive social justice and planetary sustainability and things like that, and continuing that work. And probably a third of my answers would be, or maybe up to a half would change, maybe not in essence, but in how I view things 10 years from now as it would have 10 years ago from now. So but yeah, nothing else. I guess that is something I wanted to say, but I'll stop there.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and look on this.
Well, thank you for having me.